This week's Farm Basics is brought to you by satshot.com. Satellites aren't just for NASA anymore. Use the power of satellite imagery to create variable rate management zones in your fields. To reduce input costs and increase yields on your farm, go to satshot.com.
Well, this spring, I was talking to some city people who were all concerned that the weather was getting so cold and we had some corn out of the ground that was like an inch tall and it was going to be below freezing that night and your corn's all going to die. And I said, no, what you don't understand is the growing point of the corn plant is actually below ground. And they said, what? What are you talking about? So that's what we wanted to discuss today.
Well, this relates to any plant that you have. Maybe it's a plant in your garden or a flower, really anything out there. Knowing where that growing point is very important when you're trying to kill a weed, when you're trying to grow a crop, or when you're trying to protect a crop from inclement weather.
So with growing points, it's important to first understand, are we dealing with a grass here? Or are we dealing with a broadleaf? What we're talking about is with grasses, and corn is in the grass family, so is wheat. With grasses, they have just one growing point. With broadleaves, like let's take soybeans or sunflowers, for example, they have multiple growing points. So there's a great big distinction between the grasses and the broadleaves.
Well, it all really starts with the seed. When you're looking at a grass plant, that seed is going to be right where you planted it all throughout the season. You can still dig up the plant later and find that seed attached to the root. With broadleaf crops, it's not that way. You can't find that seed anymore, and the reason why with broadleaf crops is that seed actually becomes the first leaves of the plant. Let's take soybeans for example. The soybean seed has two halves to it. That's why it's called a dicot seed, or dicotyledon, two cotyledons. When those cotyledons come out of the ground, they form the first two leaves on your soybean plant. So if you notice on the small soybean plants, those first two leaves are pretty fat and juicy. Well, that's the two halves of the seed that are going to provide food for that plant early in its growth cycle.
To continue on with that soybean plant then, once it becomes larger, you're going to have many growing points on there. You'll have one at each of those cotyledon leaves. You'll have one at each of the main branches that come off the stem. And then usually at the top of that soybean plant, a lot of times there might be 3 or even 4 or 5 growing points right there. So literally you could have a 6-inch tall soybean plant and it could have 10 to 15 growing points on it. Okay, so in other words, if let's say hail comes along or some other disaster happens and you lose half your soybean plant, it's not dead. It may not even be hurt that much in terms of overall yield. The plant is going to regrow from the growing points that are left.
With grass crops, it's a little different. We're talking about a monocot here where that seed is all one piece, it all stays together, and it sends a sprout up instead. So rather than the seed coming out of the ground and becoming leaves, it sends a sprout out. Now with that corn plant, as Brian mentioned earlier, that growing point is going to stay below the ground for the early stages of growth. Now the reason why corn can be planted a little bit earlier than soybeans is because it's going to keep that growing point safe.
So with corn, the growing point stays below ground until the corn plant reaches about the 5 to 6 collar stage, somewhere in there. Then it actually gets to ground level. Earlier I was saying that I was concerned, or some people were concerned about frost when the corn plant was an inch tall. Literally at that point, the growing point is about a 1/2 inch to even 3/4 of an inch below ground. So it would probably have to get to 18 or 20 degrees for the frost to go all the way that deep into the soil and kill that growing point. In other words, we're not real concerned about a corn plant dying very early in the season due to frost. However, if it does freeze and some of that top growth dies, it will set the maturity back a little bit on the corn plant. In other words, it won't be ready to harvest quite as quickly in the fall, and it may hurt the yield just a little bit, but again, it will not kill the corn plant.
One other thing that's interesting about that corn plant is the one growing point actually emerges from the plant and becomes the tassel. So when you're looking at a corn plant later on in the year and you see that tassel, you can think about that as the one growing point on the corn plant.
Well, we've talked about corn and soybeans and a variety of crops and their growing points, but another thing that is really important in all those crops is weed control, especially if you've got our Weed of the Week. We'll tell you how to stop it on your farm coming up later in the show.